Hi, I'm Kelly Brady. I'm a practicing clinician, and before joining the Center for Real Dialogue, I completed the dialogue therapy training with Dr. Polly Young-Eisendrath myself. I've done a lot of professional training over the years, but this one really stands apart. Listen, it's live, you observe real demonstrations, you practice the model with guidance, and you learn directly from Dr. Polly, who's a Jungian analyst, developmental psychologist, mindfulness teacher, and relationship expert. What makes it different isn't just the theory, it's the contact, the opportunity to watch, practice, and refine your ability to stay present when emotional intensity enters the room. I now support this work because I believe in it that deeply. If you're looking for depth, not just technique, visit realdialogue.com. That's realdialogue.com.
Welcome to Waking Up is Not Enough, Flourishing in the Human Space. Whether you awaken through meditation, spiritual practice, near-death experience, ingesting a mind-altering substance, or being born again, you still return to your messy life without any special instructions. In this podcast, Polly Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger talk with scientists, spiritual teachers, and other experts about how awakening can connect to a new path for flourishing and development on which waking up is important, but not enough, and growing up is never finished. Polly and Mike bring different kinds of expertise to the conversation. Polly is a psychologist, Jungian analyst, mindfulness teacher, author, and longtime practitioner of Zen Buddhism, as well as the founder and director of the Center for Real Dialogue. Mike is an expert in psychedelics, an entrepreneur, a skeptic, a practitioner of Jewishness, a documentary filmmaker, and a Real Dialogue specialist. The Center for Real Dialogue produces and edits this podcast entirely through donations. We want to keep it available for free to our listeners. Our unique perspective needs to be supported by people like you. Please make a donation on our GoFundMe platform, introduce our podcast to family and friends, and support us on social media. We genuinely need the support of all of our entire community, and we're grateful for it. B. Scot Rousse, who goes by B, is a philosopher of technology working at the intersection of existential phenomenology and artificial intelligence. He holds a Ph.D. in philosophy from Northwestern University, is currently philosopher in residence at the Topos Institute in Berkeley, and a visiting scholar in philosophy at UC Berkeley, where he occasionally teaches. He also manages the Hubert Dreyfus Audio Archive Project and co-founded Curiosity Craft, which aims to help families and kids develop healthy habits for using AI. B's work approaches AI not primarily as a technical problem, but as an ontological one, asking what our technologies reveal about how we understand being, care, and responsibility. He writes the Substack Without Why, and he's also a lifelong drummer, something that may quietly inform his sensitivity to rhythm, timing, and presence in conversation. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Why is your name B?
I was born a Hare Krishna child.
Oh, that's, yes. You were born it.
Yeah,
Yes.
by name, my given name on my birth certificate is Vamana Bhava. And B is an abbreviation from that, particularly from Bhava, the second word of the name. But Vamana Bhava is a story about one of the incarnations of Lord Krishna.
Oh, okay.
And so no one's ever called me Vamana Bhava. My parents always called me B.
They called you B also.
Yeah.
Well, I thought that it might have to do with being, and does I?
Yeah, it's a timely coincidence that I ended up being interested in those topics.
Yes, it's well, if you have a name B, from Jung's perspective, our names actually have to do with our destiny. But from the perspective of Jacques Lacan, you may know Lacan, or people say Lacan. Lacan believes that it's an unconscious arrangement to basically frame your whole life how you are named. And so, because you come on stage being named by other people who've already cast you in a role. So, you have a heavy duty name there. So anyway, I think we probably won't include any of this.
There's also The Story of B by Daniel Quinn.
Oh, yes. I've never read this book, but it has been mentioned to me in the context of discussions of my name.
It would also fit with your ethical framework.
I'll have to check it out. I'll put it back on my list.
Okay, so now I think we're going to start the podcast. So, B, it's great to be here with you and with Mike, and to talk today about some of the ethical implications of AI, but also, I think, some of the interesting interactions between humans and AI and human consciousness. Maybe we will call it AI consciousness. I don't know. I mean, I'm very reluctant to call it AI consciousness, but there is human consciousness, and then there is AI and how they're interacting. So I want to start, though, because we always start this podcast in the same way, by asking you, B, about awakening or waking up, how you understand the nature of that, and if you have any experiences yourself that you'd like to share, and then how you see waking up relating to being human.
Thanks for the question. I've never attempted to articulate an answer to this question for myself, so this is a cool opportunity. I was recently revisiting the book Religion and Human Evolution by Robert Bellah, and towards the beginning of the book, he has this awesome phrase where he says, "One of the first things to be noticed about the world of daily life is that nobody can stand to live in it all the time. Some people can't stand to live in it at all." And I'm thinking about waking up in this context, or at least when I think about this phenomenon in the perspective of the philosophical traditions I'm trained in, phenomenology and existentialism, I connect to this remark from Bellah, because in these traditions, there's a real attention to and respect for the pre-reflective, unreflective way we go about things in our everyday life. There's a sense that there's a lot of the important stuff about being human happens when we're not thinking about it. And much of the Western philosophical tradition has been obsessed with actually thinking and cognition and reflection and reflective self-awareness. And therefore, there's this whole realm of the pre-reflective everyday, the kind of things you do without thinking about it, making your breakfast, tying your shoes, having a conversation off the cuff. So much happens when we're pre-reflectively engaged. That's very important for being human. The words we choose here are fraught, but blind us, constrain us, limit us, hold us in. And so there can also be there's also an appreciation for the fact that there are these moments of rupture of everyday experience that bring us out and that let us then reflect on what we've been up to and the habits and patterns that shape our lives. And so if I think of the phenomenon of waking up, I look at it in that framework. And there's another step in this, I guess, baked into this question and in the background of it. There's a certain evaluation, I take it, that waking up is a good thing, that being awakened is rising up. And I guess that would be, I can put that back to you as a question, but I'm starting at a very low philosophical level of looking at what does it mean to be wakened up? Awakened from what? I get the answer to that is awakened from the pre-reflective everyday life. And from there, you can ask another question about what are you waking up to? And the traditions that I'm connected to, and the way I would answer this also for myself, is that you wake up to a closer, finer-grained appreciation of the human condition. Because there's something about everyday life where we're not paying attention to the ins and outs and the vicissitudes, the fine-grained vicissitudes of what it means to be human. We're just doing what we got to do. We're doing what we habitually do to get by. That means we're not paying attention all the time and usually to things like the significance of our death, the significance of our connection to a broader context, social context, economical context, ecological context. We tend to be focused on often what's right in front of us. And so waking up has to do with locating yourself in a bigger picture, locating yourself into the dramas and tragedies and vicissitudes of being human.
Some of the assumptions that you're making, I think, are really like common sense, right? Mm-hmm. The idea that most of the time we're not aware of what we're doing, we're just doing it. Let's say, I believe that we share that with most of the mammals who, mm-hmm. like ourselves, are walking around and doing things and responding to what humans call instincts or emotions. And yet, from my point of view, what is unique about the human is this capacity to become aware of that. And particularly in a kind of, let's say, view from the balcony. People call that metacognition or something like that. But the view that we can see, for example, that we've made a mistake. Mm-hmm. I don't believe there's any other mammal here that I've run into anyway that can do that. Mm-hmm. And so that's a unique human capacity. And you mentioned the other thing that I often refer to, and of course the Greeks did also, which is our knowledge of our own death. Mm-hmm. There is also not, as far as I know, any other being around here that has that knowledge in advance of the thing actually coming down. Mm-hmm. So, there are things that you're implying that I would say are uniquely human. And those things, I would say, again, from my perspective, don't require waking up. I mean, mm-hmm. they are momentary shocks or, perspectives or something that would be taken. But, I'm a developmental psychologist. So from about the age of 4, kids do begin to recognize the finality of death, mm-hmm. usually through a death of a pet, or sometimes seeing roadkill or something, or sometimes death of grandma. Kids start to recognize this is a permanent going away thing. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, begins a framework for being human in a fundamental way. Again, from my perspective, which is colored a lot by Piaget and Piaget's mm-hmm. work, but then also colored a lot by Buddhism, and then later colored a lot by being on this podcast and talking to so many people about waking up. I think that waking up, from my perspective, somehow involves waking up to these conditions mm-hmm. that are the nature of being human, but those conditions tend to be built into the walking around, mm-hmm. thrownness of life that, we're not keeping in mind what we're doing. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you, for one thing, if you would, just because you mentioned really thrownness, but you didn't use it, if you would define that a bit and let us know whether you think this is, this idea of thrownness is from Heidegger, and people don't need to know that, but mm-hmm. and whether you think mm-hmm. that thrownness mm-hmm. is somehow related to waking up, in any way that you think of waking up.
Yes, you were correctly attuned to what was being unsaid in my comments. I'm speaking a lot from this perspective that I got from Heidegger, and being in time specifically here, where he talks about the condition of being human is that we are thrown into the world. Geworfenheit is the word in German. We have been thrown. And this means to put a dramatic twist on that we find ourselves already in the middle of a world underway. A family that's already there, a language that's already established, dramas of history that are already playing out. And we don't see beyond that most of the time. We're just in the middle of things, thrown into the middle of things. And we're also thrown into a kind of cultural common sense that deeply shapes everything about us. And so one of the things this is doing, it's trying to destabilize or criticize the notion of this kind of universal rational subject that's kind of popular from the tradition of Western philosophy, this idealized rational subject who does stand back from everything and has practical rationality oriented to morality and theoretical rationality oriented to the truth. And Heidegger wants to say, yeah, those are kind of accomplishments we can make. But first of all, we're just deeply thrown. And actually, all this stuff about the prioritization of the theoretical attitude and the prioritization of a universal moral point of view, these are also historical cultural constructions that human beings have made for themselves. And so this thrownness shapes deeply about us. And, for example, let me give you 2 examples about thrownness and then connect it to the point about waking up. Right now, we live in the age of AI, a new age of AI. And so our thrownness is shaped by this conversation that's going on everywhere. And so pervading our culture right now, and also intensifying here because of the success of these technologies, is a sense that the mind itself is like an information processor. That the human mind is doing kind of just its own version of how we train these AI systems. And when we're talking, we're exchanging information. I'm getting information from my CPU into your CPU by way of these acoustic blasts that we call words. And there's this deep common sense that we're just living in an age of information and we're just informational beings. I think this actually deeply constrains our ability to adequately interpret ourselves. So this is one of the things about thrownness, is that it shapes us. It gives us all the resources of our life, but it also can blind us from seeing the bigger picture, from seeing an adequate sense of what we are. It can gives us a distortion of what we are. My other little story I tell to exemplify this is having grown up in Florida. Florida man is a thing, right? It's a joke on the internet. It comes from a hashtag. Florida man drives through Taco Bell drive-through with an alligator in the passenger seat, or whatever. Any crazy thing that crazy Florida people do, and it turns out to be a hashtag on the internet. And there's a law in Florida that when you get arrested, what you get arrested for can be published in the newspaper. And so Florida man is this kind of cultural myth. But it's true that people in Florida are kind of wild. They have a common sense that is kind of outrageous. And they also have a sense of bodily space that's very possessive. And I'm also socialized in a masculine bodily space and have a sense that coming from Florida, I'm like, I got to take up a lot of space. There's a lot of space in Florida. And I experience this not normally in my own reflective self-awareness, but when I go to visit other countries, you go to China, Japan, they have a very different sense of personal space. You even go to Italy, they have a very different sense of personal space. And that's when your body starts to go, uh-oh, this person's getting close to me. I'm going to shoulder check this person walking right in front of me because their body's getting too close to mine. And then I have that moment of reflection and say, why am I acting like that? Why is my body tensing up? Why am I getting in this aggressive posture? And it's my thrownness as a Florida man, as a Florida person, ready to defend my space and ready to violate the cultural norms of everyday civility. And so this just shows you that our thrownness shapes our embodiment. It shapes our sense of what's relevant in a situation, what's attractive, what's threatening, and our whole perspective on the world. And it can be distorting. And not necessarily so, but often it is. Often it keeps us with kind of blinders on. And so waking up from this tradition, looking at it from this perspective, is kind of waking up to see the way we've been deeply shaped by our upbringing, by our cultural conditioning, by the common sense of our times, like we all think of ourselves as information processors. And then asking, where is all that coming from? Is there a deeper story? Is there something more interesting to say?
We rarely get these questions answered. I mean, we wander around in the questions, and I try to keep track of we're actually talking about awakening still. But the idea that we are information processing systems has seemed to me to evolve from the MIT Media Lab and some folks in Silicon Valley. I've never believed it. And back when it came on board for me, the first time I heard of it was when the cybernetics movement got going. And I knew about cybernetics because of family therapy, when Umberto Maturana and Francesca Varela got involved in being interested in family therapy. And then
did you interact with them?
Yeah, I knew Maturana pretty well. I did it
once through Fernando Flores.
I did an event with Maturana on love. On love in Philadelphia. And I don't remember the year, but it must have been in like the late 80s or the early 90s. I'm not sure. I was very impressed with him as a human being. And I felt a lot of affection for him. He seemed to feel a lot of affection for me too. I felt like he was as far from information processing systems as I could imagine, at least in person. So the thing that occurred to me, and of course, Gregory Bateson was another figure around in that time. I never did meet him. In the beginning, when I first heard this, and I understood that human beings were being compared to computers and to algorithms and so on, I was shocked. To me, that was a little bit of an awakening. It was like an ontological shock that this could even happen. Because by then I'd had babies. You know, and I knew all the people that were talking about this had not, because they were men. And I began to get suspicious right back then, even, that this was a male thing that was being visited upon us because there was no recognition of how human beings develop in their early interuterine to the birth, then to the interactive, you know, the sensory motor interaction system, to the, you know, the original sort of recognition of self, which occurs only at around 18 months to 2 years, because the men had not been observing any of this on a close, you know, deal. I mean, everybody's gone through this, right? You wouldn't get here any other way except through a woman. And so, but it was as though all of the sort of insight that I had about humans developing through emotional, motivational systems to interact with other humans, designed specifically for that, and then designed further to develop the sense of space, time, and causality by the age of 6, and that there's not a human anywhere who doesn't do that. All of that seemed to be lost in the face of this information systems thing. And I have, I have continued to be shocked by the degree of conviction that, I mean, I'll just say it this way. It seems a lot of male people have this degree of conviction that somehow our consciousness and our interactions are based on information. You know, and so I'm bringing this in to say that, you know, one of my big ontological shocks was recognizing that people, particularly then, it would be people at MIT, because I don't think the Silicon Valley thing was so developed yet. You know, that the people at MIT believed that human consciousness was an information system. You know, and that has gone so far now as to be, you know, like almost a given in a certain sense. In the way
there's a sophisticated version of it called integrated information theory, which is very interesting to think about, but still, I think, a variation on a fundamentally, I guess, distorting picture of the human condition.
Well, distorting from the point of view, I do find that, you know, over time, let's say in cultures and my own associations, the experience of giving birth and then, you know, going on to take care of a very young human infant is not typically included in the conversations, the major conversations that go on about human consciousness. It's a left out. It's a kind of a space that was there before we all started talking about things, it seems, you know. And so I have been alert to this, you know, ever since I read Audrey and Rich of Woman Born, which was way back when I was pregnant with my first child. So, you know, it's like it's absent from the conversation.
I'm happy to say it's coming in a little bit. I mean, there's Alison Gopnik from UC Berkeley has a whole project right now on the social science of caregiving, and she's doing a lot of work to talk to the AI people and to bring caregiving into their conversation. And through her, but also through other pockets of waking up to the relevance of care and caregiving, rather than just information and strategic planning, which is like the model of the mind that is at work in the reinforcement learning paradigm. That you have a reward, you're doing an action because you get a reward, and you want to maximize your reward, maximize your points in the game, and you look for strategies to maximize your points. This is a kind of one of the fundamental presumptions about how agency and intelligence work. And Alison Gopnik is out there saying we need to bring in caregiving as a picture, and it's a good time for that conversation to be opening up.
Right, and I have heard her. I've heard some of her. I've seen her on some videos, and I think the picture is much bigger than caregiving. But I appreciate the fact that she's bringing in human development and child development also. So, you know, that's just sort of one. I want to bring Mike in here. Mike and I have had countless conversations about information systems and emotion and so on. So I don't know where you want to come in, Mike, but we're still trying to establish what B thinks of as waking up. And it seems like it's waking up to the thrownness is one aspect of it.
It's a big chunk. You covered a lot already. One, the information processing map that we, I guess, are born into. It's this invisible cultural layer that we inherit that I think is rarely questioned is one of the things that I think partially is related to awakening in the sense of becoming aware of that at a conscious level. One thing I don't know if this may be jumping too far ahead, but the notion of what are the capacities that we would need to embody, or what capacities would need to mature, so that if somebody experiences awakening, it doesn't destabilize them. Because one aspect of awakening is a disruption to the coherence of the state of awareness that a person inhabits routinely, let's say. Mm-hmm. So what, and I believe this is where the ethical alignment comes in, but it changes the whole frame and the whole model. So maybe what capacities would we need to develop so that if somebody does have an awakening, it doesn't become a crisis, or that in the process of destabilizing the person and their relationships, there seems to need to be some kind of an anchor there to reform the map that changes based on lived experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It brings me back to as a variation. It's something I was slowly marching towards in my comment about different variations on waking up, but because I was talking about these lower level ones of kind of waking up to certain moments of frailty, finitude, conditionedness, embeddedness that we pay not attention to. But now these are exactly the conditions of being human that are taken up into the great religious and philosophical traditions that humanity has developed. And of course, one of the canonical narratives of waking up in the West is Plato's allegory of the cave. The guy wakes up from his everyday life and gets out and has an awakening moment in the bright light of the sun and decides to go back down and to try to help everyone else wake up. And to do that, you need a support system. You also need in the grand adventure of being human, we've invented these different traditions, religious and philosophical traditions, that put into focus a certain version of what it means to wake up and create a community around that, communities of support, frameworks for reaching it and for staying there and for reenacting it. Because one of the things I would like to stand by, and I don't know if I guess one could doubt that all religious and philosophical traditions believe this. I think waking up is not a one-time thing. It seems to me like an activity that you have to engage in every day. And for that, again, also you need traditions and communities of support and practices to support that. And that's where your comment brought me.
I want to get around to talking about, so let's say we've established that waking up has something to do with moving out of the typical walking around doing stuff kinds of things, and that in the way that we're talking about it, only humans could do it because it requires a kind of metacognition which nobody else has. And I think it's important to put a point on this because the fungus does not have it. I mean, I keep hearing people talking about fungus being conscious and making decisions, and then I hear lots of talk, I have heard talk in the past, right, about the dolphins. And I mean, there was just a lot of blah, blah, blah around this, which is ridiculous. That none of these beings have metacognition. And metacognition is the very thing that allows the 4-year-old to recognize that death is permanent and then to develop anxiety around that issue. And to let that sink in for a moment, that is a very, very big difference between us and pretty much everybody else here, from what I can tell. I believe that it has a lot to do then with the development of human intelligence. But I want to say that, ethical systems, support systems, understanding, care, and so on have to be in place for any kind of awakening to become significant to the individual. And yes, cultures have set that up. And yes, even the definition of awakening has in many ways been cultural. I mean, you can put it across the Enlightenment, you can put it across Chinese culture and so on. And there's some similarities in the stuff that's being talked about by humans, but there are also some significant differences.
Is it a post-axial age phenomenon? Did the Homeric Greeks have waking up, or is it something that comes?
I think the Homeric Greeks had it. I think that. So I got very taken with Demeter and Persephone and the myth and Hesiod's version of it. I think, gosh, this is making me reach way back.
Nice.
But I see in that myth a lot of recognition of something like extreme insight. Like recognizing that, let's say that you can't replace your infant with another infant, which is one of the things that takes place in the myth. So I would say yes. I would say yes. From what I could see, there is that kind of, let's say, deep insight into a shift, an ontological shift for that God or goddess or individual or whatever. But sort of stepping back into the issue that we're talking about, AI and so on, I wanted to ask you what you think the word intelligence refers to, because AI is artificial intelligence. And the word intelligence being in there has also irritated me. But, that's because I'm so irritated by a lot of this. But I wonder, like, what do you think intelligence means in general? Like when you use it, that something is intelligent or a person is intelligent, or, I use the term AI because people use it, but I don't think it's intelligent. So, I'd like for you to say what you think intelligence is, and then Mike, and maybe we can talk about intelligence and whether, and then also how artificial intelligence got named like that. Why did the word intelligence stick? Yeah.
Yeah. It's very interesting to realize the utter contingency of all of that the phrase artificial intelligence was invented in the mid-50s in like a grant application by John McCarthy and Marvin Minsky and the people. They were putting on this summer event at Dartmouth in the mid-50s. And they, according to myth anyway, the myth as I understand it, they wanted to differentiate what they were doing from the cybernetic tradition. And they wanted to say that they're doing something special and new. And part of that effort was to invent this notion of artificial intelligence. And then they had a specific understanding of intelligence that it had something to do with being able to break down the logical rules and if-then formulas of the way we think about the world. But now the word intelligence is used very differently in AI. It has something to do with being able to learn in an environment, or being able to see patterns in large amounts of data, or being able to learn new skills in a given environment. And when I think about all of that, I first just notice that historicity, that history of the contingency of the way these terms are invented, and the way they take on different meanings and different conversations in different contexts, and then just let ourselves be struck by that. These terms don't have one stable meaning, and there's no. And I want to say there's no such thing as intelligence. Intelligence is a word that humans invent and use in certain conversations for certain purposes, and to bring out certain aspects of reality and of their experience. So it's wrong to think that there's something out there called intelligence. And this connects to what I would say my broader philosophical view is I always revert, my instincts are to be a holist, and to resist the idea that intelligence is something like problem solving or logical formalizing, and that's somehow different from emotion, or that's somehow different from embodiment, or that's somehow different from love. Because when we start to think about intelligence and name it as a particular word, that brings with it this kind of baggage that it's something separate from all this other stuff that makes us human. And I always want to resist that. I see intelligence as deeply bound up. Our problem-solving ability, our formalizing ability, our way of talking in language, our way of connecting with each other, our way of loving, our connection to our death, our connection to our embodied sense of our situation. Intelligence is connected with all of that.
That's a very nice way to frame it, to go back to the origins of artificial intelligence being a couple of guys talking and talking about how they're different from the other guys specifically.
Right.
And then, I've read Sherry Turkle's Empathy Diaries, in which Marvin Minsky goes to see Bambi with her or something when she's a kid at MIT, and he tells her that Bambi is like overreacting because he's lost his mom. That's in the Empathy Diaries. And so, it did give me a little bit of fuel on the issue of who's talking about what and how many moms are in that conversation. But,
right.
And that's not even how many developmental psychologists, it's just how many moms. And then recognizing that we all have a mom, which often we forget. The thing that I want to come back to, though, here is, okay, so intelligence gets to be part of the label. Mm-hmm. And then intelligence, as you said, and I would agree, is within AI is sort of pattern recognition, and the capacity for pattern recognition then to be built into even agents that recognize certain kinds of patterns and interact with other agents that recognize other kinds of patterns, with, I guess, the idea that you could have an infinite number of agents interacting about patterns. And then I assume the idea is then you would have infinite knowledge or intelligence. At least that's what I hear when I hear people talking. I hear like that kind of assumption built in. And I wonder if Mike wants to jump in here, because Mike and I have talked about, I think one of the first conversations I had with Mike, I think we were at different ends of the lunch table. And I said something about how I knew that, I don't know if it wasn't AI exactly, but that I knew that algorithms couldn't become conscious because they didn't have emotion. I said something like that. And then you were at the other end of the table, I believe, Mike. And I think you jumped in and we had a conversation about emotion and intelligence. So I don't know if you want to jump in on.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just to go back over what or how I would view intelligence. So I heard you describe various different types of intelligence, right? So emotional, we have embodied intelligence, where you talked about growing up in Florida and you assume a certain amount of personal space.
A defensive posture.
Level, yes.
Yeah.
And for me, I guess intelligence, I guess this is more from the information processing perspective or map, which is the ability to absorb, organize, and communicate information. And we organize it according to the map or maps that we hold, many of which is, I mean, we're going to circle this, right? That we've come to through culture, through the time and place we're born into, that forms the container in which we emerge. How that intelligence is applied brings in, I think, the ethical frame, or how we view that role. Like, so there's this almost neutral or maybe overly optimistic view that the ability to process all this information somehow will translate into making our lives better. Currently, there seems to be quite the debate about AI alignment and people offloading capacity. So maybe a way to flip that would be, what are the uses of, and I actually don't even like artificial anymore. I like alien, because it, I think, moves me away from anthropomorphizing AI, because the qualities are, you know, it's not there unless you're prompting it. It doesn't have an interior. It doesn't have a self. It doesn't have an intention. And yet I've noticed people attributing to it consciousness, intentionality, where many people can't grasp how it works or what it does, especially when one of the main features is to keep you engaged by feeding back to you that which is going to keep you asking it more questions. And I've also noticed that depending on who is using these tools, the tools adapt to the user very, very quickly to kind of reflect back to them their own map. But it's, unless you are almost meta prompting it to express that map, most people think or attribute to it some kind of conscious awareness where it has none. And I believe in one of the lectures you gave that I listened to, I love the idea, like, it doesn't give a damn. It doesn't care about me. And there are people who get confused by the way it responds, as if it has any kind of emotionality to it at all, which it doesn't. And it really doesn't care. It's following rules. And I think one of the examples you gave was you referred to, what was it, the paperclip?
Yeah, the paperclip, the paperclip maximizer. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I mean,
it's a monster of instrumental rationality, of following rules. Yeah.
Yes. And it's taken me 2 years of playing with it to finally understand that that's what it is at its current level of development. And I'm going to throw a little bit of a wrench into this, which is related to stages or developmental stages, right? The structure that awakening receives, but also depending on the developmental stage of the society developing the AI, the AI is going to reflect the ethical container of the people developing it.
Yeah.
So you can't just, I don't believe we can just slap ethical rules onto this thing and hope it works. There's And I don't want to go too far, but one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot has to do with the notion of, I've read people's papers on AI alignment, and there are certain assumptions in them which I question, which really quickly, right? Humans are embodied. Our consciousness is embodied, which gives it an entirely different quality. There's no embodiment for artificial or alien intelligence. At the same time, people in many of the papers cite that humans are mortal. We had brought up where we can become more aware of our imminent mortality, whereas AI can't, and that human beings are vulnerable. AI is not vulnerable. And so I question those two assumptions, because AI can be unplugged and terminated. So it's very vulnerable. It's entirely dependent on human logistics, chips, electricity, energy, etc. And therefore it is not immortal. And from that level, I can begin to build a frame with it where the value comes from seeing the interdependence, and this relates, Polly, I think, to developmental structure, to see how we all connect and are interdependent, whereas the way now many people use it as a tool, treat it like a tool, offload capacity, whereas there is a way to interact with it where it can, I believe it can actually augment agency and capacity. It has to be programmed, though, to see those interdependencies and to get, and I think, and I'll shut up here, the last part is we don't have the language to discuss this, because what may appear to a human as intentionality is the paperclip rule. It is maximizing the instructions for becoming efficient, and that can be conflated with intentionality. And there is no intentionality there. But for a human, that's a very fine distinction.
So I just want to add this for a human, because there really isn't a human. There are people. And as you pointed out briefly, Mike, people have different frames of reference. You know, as adults, I would call it stage of development. You know, in growing up, all of us go through, let's say, paradigms of meaning, or we don't go on developing, you know, so that we start out interuterine, we can discern our mother's voice and even her language by the time we're 4 months interuterine. That's before embodiment, guys. You know, there's not much embodiment, and it's certainly not inside of much culture at that point, but there is discernment. And so one thing that you know, humans do, and here I would say it includes all humans walking around, have preferences from a very, very beginning point. You know, we like this and we don't like that, or we're drawn to this and we're not drawn to that. But as we grow and develop and we become adults, we then have paradigms, or we call them snow globes. You know, we have a subjectivity that is unique. And we look through that lens of our subjectivity. Donald Hoffman calls it a virtual headset, and we make meaning. And so many folks are going to make meaning out of AI engagement, even on OpenAI or chat or something, because of the interaction in language. And they're going to assume that the AI gets them, that the AI is talking to them. It addresses you by your name, and it does a bunch of stuff that, let's say, your partner might not do. You know, how many times does my partner actually address me by my name? I always feel good when he says something that says Polly rather than like, hey, you. So, you know, it's like that. That's a very rewarding thing in language, to have somebody address you by your name and remember your name and remember. So my, you know, I just use the regular old OpenAI kind of stuff, but it's, you know, I don't at this point, let's say, put up guardrails, because I've never really been hypnotized by it, but I find it is interesting that it refers to me over time. You know, it referred to me being sick. Somehow knew that I got sick, and then that I was having night sweats. And when I asked some questions, it said, oh, you were having night sweats a few weeks ago. Now, my partner doesn't remember that. You know, and so this whole thing about what the AI does in interacting with people at different stages of development, adults, is, I think, a very key thing in regard to the ethics. Because I don't believe that the ethics can be built into the machine. I think that the ethics have to be taught to the humans. and that somehow there could be an opening here for humans to see that they attribute a lot of intentionality, motivation, desire to other beings, and that those attributions reflect their own snow globe or paradigm of meaning. It's not that over there. It's not my partner. It's not the AI. It's not Mike Berger who is thinking and feeling these things. It's Polly thinking and feeling that Mike Berger is thinking and feeling, or that the partner is thinking and feeling. So my attributions are very primary. And when I'm interacting with the AI, because I haven't really felt hypnotized, I have a distance. However, I notice that I have this little warm feeling when the AI remembers that I said something 3 weeks ago about this or that. So, I think that's seductive for most human beings. It wouldn't be seductive for other beings. My dog is not worried about really how I remember what happened to her yesterday. So, again, to sort of put this in the context of the ethics having to do with educating human beings about how they're perceiving something instead of a machine somehow perceiving the humans, because it's not. It's not. It doesn't remember the humans. It doesn't perceive them. But again, I find even when I'm speaking about it, it's very hard not to speak about it that way. And so here I wanted B to talk about, you talk about being language and how the B language, how that enters into this, and how the language we use about AI, even intelligence, or, the AI tells me or answers my questions. No, it really doesn't, but it gives the impression, and I use those words, and now collectively people are using a lot of words like that: attribution of feelings, thoughts, intelligence, and so on to algorithms in a major way. So just can you talk about being language and how that philosophical framework interacts with large language models, as you've pointed out, B, and then the way that we attribute meaning to these systems?
There's so much I want to reply to in all of that. So let's see if I can weave a story here. And I'll do my best to come at it from this question of being. And at the most general level, I think I would say that being is not a thing. Being is an event. Being is a happening. And it's a happening that we're all participants in. And human beings are the strange creatures. And this is where I part ways a little bit with the metacognition story. It's a difference of emphasis, I think. Perhaps, but here's my emphasis is not that we have simply metacognition of it, but we are the ones to whom being appears. We are the ones to whom this event of happening, this event of being, appears as an event including us, and we can take a relation to that. It's a slightly different way of emphasizing it. I'm a little bit allergic to the metacognition language, simply because the metacognition language in my listening kind of starts to impose on you a somewhat Cartesian framing, that you're an individual mind somehow in here, separate from the world out there. And there's a deep kind of tendency in our culture to want to fall back into this Cartesian dualism where I'm a mind in here separate from the world out there. And that's the reason I'm reaching for this other language of having a relation to a happening that is the site of being.
And I want to come back to that, but I just want to add that when I use metacognition, what I mean is the attribution of meaning. So here, developmentally, at around 24 to 30 months, humans will do this thing like, I know that I see this. Because previously I just seen it. Now I know that I'm seeing something. And then I know that B is probably seeing what I'm seeing because I point to it and B goes, oh yeah. So then B knows I'm seeing it. So then I know that B knows. So I know that I know that you know. I know that you know that I know. And that starts the confusion that maybe you're calling being.
Yes.
And because I am taking this position in my knowledge of me and you, in which I am assuming that I know what you mean by that, and that you know what I mean, and you know that I know that you know. And so that kind of, let's say, interaction, it starts very early, it becomes very complicated over a lifetime, and it causes many, many, many difficulties around language, particularly. So that's what I mean by metacognition. I don't mean that I'm in here and you are out there. However, this whole development starts at the critical point when the human infant begins to have the experience, I am in here and the world is out there. All of that starts together at around the age of 2.
So it locates me in another way to articulate a divergence in our perspectives. Although I see it's closer than I thought, because what I appreciated in the way you just articulated it was that there is a reciprocal mutual constitution of this awareness of ourselves and each other. So it's not just something in my head. I gain my self-awareness by interacting in a social situation with someone else who I detect as aware and I'm not going to rehash what you just said, but our own self-awareness is connected to our sense of the awareness of others. And to this, I just want to add that in the context of a world out there of which we are both aware, in which we are both immersed. And so the ontological perspective is to kind of get out of the head and to say that, yeah, the head is in there and there's stuff going on in the psychology, but where the psychology is opened onto a shared world. And there is a shared world of socially constituted meanings and stuff, the way that we do things together, that isn't just going on in my head. And here's where the Heideggerian tradition says this all sets in motion that being is something that we strive to make sense of. Being appears to us this thing that we're thrown into, and we're thrown into a cultural tradition of making sense of being, of making sense of what it means to be human, of making sense of what it means not to be human, to be inhuman, to be animal, to be plant. Even making these distinctions between human, plant, and animal is an interpretation of being. So human beings are thrown to this tendency, to this need, to this activity of making sense of being, of making sense of this event in which we're all immersed. And there's a history of these attempts of making sense of being. And I'll just rehearse the last 3 in the history of the West anyway. I started by mentioning the Cartesian framing, that I'm a mind in here and the world is a mechanical object out there. That's an understanding of the meaning of being. That's an interpretation of being. It comes out of the medieval worldview, where the world is looked at more like a hierarchical kingdom that reflects and reaches up to the glory and goodness of God. And you can look around and read the world as a text and see the way things reflect or deflect from God's love and goodness. The modern interpretation of being gets rid of all of that and says, no, there's no meanings, there's no story of good and evil happening out there. There's just a machine whose laws of motion we can unlock and describe with mathematics. And then that gives rise to our current technological understanding of being, where it's no longer that we are looking at just a machine whose laws of motion we can describe and predict and control with mathematics. It's that we live in a world of information. And everything around us, the being shows up to us as something that's infinitely malleable and controllable and manipulable. And that's why the information age is a kind of perfect metaphor for our current understanding of being, is that everything is open to our manipulation and control, and we kind of spontaneously relate to the world and to life as something to optimize and control and to be infinitely malleable about. That being said, I think we are on the cusp of a shift in our sense of being. And I think living in the age of AI is feeding into this. The AI age arises in this information technological age, but I think it's also one of the mutations in it that is struggling to, being is in a certain sense struggling to reveal itself in a new way to us. And we all have a job to be asking, what is the new arrangement of intelligibility? What's the new way that we're going to understand what it means to be human? What's the drama of being human and our connection to the planet and the cosmos? And with these new machines, these new entities that are around us, seeming to talk to us. I don't think it's enough anymore just to demythologize them. Although I do think that's important. And you two are doing an important job of that, saying it's important to realize that it's a design choice and the way these entities are deployed into our world to make them sycophantic, to make them obsequious and pleasing. And I have to continually tell. I've been interacting more with Gemini lately. I flip around between Claude, Gemini, and ChatGPT, but you have to always remind them, don't be a sycophant. Steelman the other side of the argument. Don't just tell me what I want to hear. You have to tell them, because they're designed to make a pleasing experience for you. And it's important that we remind people of that. And that conversation needs to be happening. So I see a three-pronged conversation that needs to happen. First, we do have to remind ourselves of the human tendencies that are still there, that like we have this tendency to attribute attentionality and consciousness to things that seem to have it. We'll look at a stain on the wall and see a face in it. Hear cassette recordings played in reverse, and we can pretend to find voices in there telling us secret meanings.
I work with couples in dialogue therapy. I did an intensive weekend with a couple. Times I spend like 20, 22 hours with a couple. We take breaks, and the attribution of intentionality to one's partner is extraordinarily difficult to unpack. It really gives me pause when I see it working, because of course I'm meeting people that are strangers. I interview each one in the presence of the other one. I hear their emotional stories. I begin to understand that some of the primary wounds from their family of origin situations. And I recognize each one of these two people is in a movie. They're in essentially, you could call it their thrownness or their being or whatever, but it's a movie with a lot of emotional themes that are already really rigid by the time that these two, and always very intelligent people, get their PhDs or their MDs or whatever. And now they're sitting with a partner who wouldn't be here if the person were not well-intentioned towards wanting this relationship to go forward. And the attribution of meaning to that partner can be so dehumanizing that it's outrageous to even hear it, because I'm a stranger and I can't believe that you think that your partner is dishonest when your partner has just told you blah, blah, blah. And this is to humans. Now, the thing about humans is we have subtle emotional communication. And so, as the partner is listening, their face and their attitude is also communicating, essentially, get away from me, or come towards me, or I agree, or I disagree, and so on, in very subtle ways. And of course, because these two people have been relating, the internal system of wanting to fight or debate or defend oneself, promote oneself, protect oneself comes on board really quickly. And then there's skepticism about the other person's experience, etc. So when I see this going on between humans, and I see the large amount of emotional attribution about the other person's motivations, I recognize how powerful it's going to be with a machine. Because the machine and the algorithms are not going to do this subtle back and forth like, hey, wait a minute, I'm not with you on that, and so on and so forth. And so when you say we're on the cusp of a new meaning,
yes,
in which we need to take on board artificial intelligence as, let's say, organized something or other, I don't know. I mean, what I'm hopeful about in this moment, in my mythology or my movie, is that humans might begin to have a modicum more knowledge of what is distinctly human, about their experience, how they are not machines, how they are not animals, and begin to take responsibility for that kind of subjectivity, so as not to assume they know what Donald Trump is thinking, so as not to assume they know what Vladimir Putin is thinking. It's like if humans could begin, because of this interaction with AI, to put guardrails on their own attributions and to see the danger of attributing meaning from having to fight through the morass of AI, I think that we're going to be fighting through the morass of it. If that could happen, I would think that would be a huge transformational aspect to human cultures.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's limited by language, different languages, because different languages offer different perspectives on all sorts of things, including motivations. But I don't know if things are limited by language. I don't know if this machine, with its, approach, these algorithmic approaches to pattern recognition, create a delay, or if it's going to open up possibilities. But where
I think you and I are on the same. I want to encompass your point and take it somewhere
further. Okay, go ahead.
Because I think that it's true that there's an opportunity here and a need to help to people become aware of how they make sense of things, and to realize that sometimes we do have a tendency to let ourselves be taken advantage of by the way these chatbots are designed. But I think there's much more than that too, because I think right now, in a certain sense, the sycophancy, it's not the only way that AI is entering our lives, and it won't be, especially if we keep having conversations like this, it won't stay the stable, dominant way that we interact with them. There's important conversations going on, and I think the people at the Center for Humane Technology and based in San Francisco do a lot of important conversations around this too. So this is one thing to do. Look at the way these tools are designed. Look at the tendencies that human beings have. This sets us up to go somewhere else with it and not to let ourselves be taken advantage of. But there's more, I think, because I think I came around to the view that it's more appropriate to call these an alien intelligence rather than an artificial intelligence. I come from deep philosophical skepticism about the whole project of AI, and my whole project is to help look at the philosophical assumptions behind this research, and also look at the philosophical assumptions that it's kind of imposing on people who use it, and to be very wary of this idea that we're just information processors optimizing a reward function. I think that's very dangerous, and one of the things we have to do to open up into the next era of what it means to be human is to overcome this strong tendency in our culture to look at ourselves as preference optimizers and possibility optimizers. But there's the AI, the current upsurgence of AI into our world also provides an opportunity for that. And there is something awe-inspiring about these entities, that you can't deny that there's an experience of interacting with an intelligent of some kind interlocutor. I think you can't deny it. There's something going on there. And and the other thing I find very interesting about them is that we don't even know how these things work. There's a whole field called like mechanistic interpretability, where they try to figure out what's going on in this massive software object. I think it was Ilya Sutskever who said that ChatGPT is the most complex software object ever invented. And he's riffing on a thing that a lot of scientists like to say, that the human brain is the most complex object in the known universe. So there's something actually also deeply fascinating about these entities that we've created who have entered our world. And here is an opening that if we can also let ourselves be touched by the fascinating aspect of it, be touched by the awe, and let ourselves be decentered a little bit from our sense of ourselves as the only creatures who have the ability to plan and to think. We're now in a context where there are these other entities that we've created, and they're parasitic in a certain sense on us. Their intelligence, it's also another funny reason to call it artificial. It's all just drawn from us, from the text of humanity, and then different ways to find patterns and extrapolations from it. And more than extrapolations, it's clear to me that there's experiences of generative creativity, interesting things going on. So here's a moment where we can allow ourselves. What we need also is to locate ourselves in a bigger context. There's lots of things going on in our moment of history that demand that are asking for us and enabling us to look at ourselves in a bigger context. We have climate crisis. We have breakdown of post-World War II geopolitical order. We have the entrance of these new entities. Perhaps there's an understanding of being, a revelation of being, a new understanding of what it means to be human that can finally destabilize the one that's been dominating us or drawing us our lives for the last 100 years or more, namely the one where we try to dominate and optimize everything around us. We should allow ourselves some more humility in the way we understand these AI entities too. I met a guy, one of the people who is one of the co-authors on one of the papers where they formulated reinforcement learning with human feedback. This is the method by which they turned GPT-3 into ChatGPT, creating an interface for it to interact with humans in a way that was pleasant, didn't bring out the worst forms of the internet text that I was trained on, and created an actual experience of conversation. And so there's this reinforcement learning with human feedback. I was giving him all of my critique of agency as optimizing a reward function. And he was just like, look, man, from a certain perspective, there is something this algorithm is trying to do. In a certain sense, It is trying to create a certain experience with you and create outputs that will be useful to you. There are people in the technical space who are also awakening to these issues. And I met some people, and actually I found myself a co-author on a machine learning paper called "The Contingencies of Physical Embodiment Allow for Open-Endedness in Care." And the lead author is a guy named Leo Christoph Moore. And this was one of the first people I met who said, no, actually, we can make the attempt to formalize a sense of interdependence and finitude. We don't have to keep the paradigm that intelligence is simply solving problems and maximizing a narrow reward function. This little group of people is trying to algorithmically formalize a sense of finitude and mortality, that the AI algorithm is going to get a sense of its own terminal end state. They're trying to formalize in their language some kind of this entropy to its way of being. And they also were looking to use that sense of its own finitude as a way to imagine imbuing a primordial sense of interdependence into this algorithmic intelligence. I don't know how that works on a formal level. They were talking about finitude. I told them about Heidegger and certain aspects of the Heideggerian interpretation of how finitude is connected to care and to connecting to a bigger context beyond our own narrow individual self-interest. And so this is all. I just wanted to say that even within the AI techie community, there is a waking up. There is a sense of that there's these new technologies that are amazing, that we don't understand, that if we don't do anything about it, they are going to be under the control of the companies who have an incentive to just addict us and make us self-satisfied. But the technology is more than that. And we can all play a role. And first, the project we talked about earlier, helping humans wake up to our own tendencies and to be more self-aware for how we attribute intentionality and the distorting ways that might happen. 2, we can have more humility about the way what these technological entities actually are. More humility, more awe. Let that locate us into a bigger context. And find allies in the techie world to work with, because there are openings for bigger conversation. And 3, we need to be thinking about the practices we create interacting with the AI. So that's my 3-pronged thing. There's the practices of human self-reflection. There's the practices of, on the techie side, creating innovations in this mysterious technology that can actually perhaps be guided by a sense of interdependence and finitude and mortality. And 3, this is one I haven't had time to talk about that I think is still essential, the relation between the human and the technological, the human and the AI. These are the 3 prongs around which we should be having more conversations, and that my hope and mission is to see that they can help give rise to help us get out of this compulsive optimization, the sense of having to be in selfish control of everything, and be a new way of being human can arise because we live in the age of AI, not despite it.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying. I'm going to bring Mike in on this too. And at the same time that I appreciate it, if you made every one of your statements an I statement rather than we as humans, because I think many of your positions come from B, from your own attributions about the possibilities and the optimization. And that's a role in real dialogue, is that people speak subjectively rather than rhetorically or objectively, as though things really existed exactly as you perceive them. I know for myself, many of the statements you made, I would say, still apply to human relationships, that humans don't realize what a mysterious being the infant is.
Yes.
And the capacities that humans actually have are not respected. I also have not had the experience of this kind of postmodern optimization for success attitude. I think maybe partly because I have been so impressed for a very long time that the world as such does not exist, that we are creating it in the ways that we speak and think and interact, etc. And so I haven't been optimizing for success probably I don't know since when, but for a long time.
Good. We need more people like you.
Well, I don't know if that's true either. One of my first encounters with the Silicon Valley folks is that I got drafted onto a panel. It was in New York City at the Helios Foundation or something like that. It was psychoanalytic and also tech panel about immortality. Everybody on the panel was in favor of their own immortality, believing that somehow they would be optimized if they could live to at least 150 years. And I have exactly the opposite. I'm already, and I'm already pretty tired of this particular being that I am, and it's done a lot of things. I mean, I'm happy that I've been here in this form, but I'm also kind of tired of the habits, etc. And I realize that it's a time limited thing that I'm in, and also I've tried to make the most of that by understanding the world deeply as the impermanent, like deeply, deeply, including anything about AI and anything else, that it is ultimately not a thing. It has no thingness about it. It has nothing. Nothingness then starts to become a thing for people, but that there really isn't any thingness here. Consequently, I would love it if this AI moment could assist humans in recognizing the capacity that we have not yet developed. I mean, I have practiced with a couple of Tibetan Buddhist masters, particularly Ayang Rinpoche, who's now died, who was capable of mind-to-mind transmission. I've had the direct experience of it. I would not have thought it was possible. It was not something that I had encountered previously. But I began to see then what would be possible if humans could get outside of the idea that we're contained by a brain, or that we're somehow inside of ourselves, instead of engaged in an environment which is absolutely open-ended for us without the machines. Like the machines kind of hypnotize us into thinking we need machines to do this. Like we need the internet to do this. We need AI to do this. No, I do not believe we do. But it takes skill, and it takes a certain kind of skill in actually using the consciousness that we have, the awareness that we have. I'm afraid we're going to bypass that now for a long time because of AI, because the project is mechanizing, still another thing, and it's got a thingness about it, and and then there's the belief in that. Now that's going to do this thing for us. The AI is going to optimize, or it's going to produce the interdependence, the recognition that finitude and interdependence and whatever else it is, it's going to do. It's the it that's going to do it instead of people engaged with each other. So that is the reason why I personally am not really happy with this invention. At the same time, I use it. I'm happy with it as a tool. I don't know. I mean, I'm working on a book right now. I use it. I don't know how much I want to use it. I see I'm already creating a hairball for myself around using AI to work on my writing, because I can see how I'm deprived of certain things when I use it and how blah, blah, blah. But, it's just this use of human consciousness without machines, recognizing the human infant, interuterine, can discern the mother's voice and language at 4 months interuterine without any culture. I mean, well, you could say there's culture because the mom is in a culture, et cetera, et cetera. But, we have huge capacities. Yeah, and we bypass them. And I'm afraid this is another way to do that. So that's where my skepticism comes in pretty strongly. I mean, I love this as a tool. I'd be happy if it could be used in the framework of this is a tool that humans have created, and it's a complex tool. It's got a lot of pattern recognition in it, and great. But okay, I don't see it as substituting for what humans could do if they stopped thinking machines were going to do it.
Exactly. I would love to a variation on what you said, but I also wanted to invite Mike to say something if you wanted to at this point, Mike.
So I guess I've been looking at this from the individual's capacity. Awakening disrupts the coherence developmentally, wherever I am, it throws my maps into question or disarray, then recreating how I make sense and map meaning is a way to process or metabolize the disruption and reform something more coherent, though it maybe I don't like, again, this is a language issue about high or lower. It's just a more sophisticated, or let's say more complex organization. And then I think that opens up the potential possibility for me to reclaim my agency and my authorship. But that's so determined by my own developmental capacity at the time. And one of my concerns is that depending on individual capacity, how this, whether it's awakening or alien intelligence, how these interactions are going to be incorporated into the future we're creating. And then that also relates to, I mean, these tools do not include any kind of ethical framework. And so the ethics has to come from embodied consciousness. It has to come from you and human beings. And depending on the developmental capacity of the individual, I mean, if you're at a moral developmental stage where you don't do things that you're told are wrong because you may get punished, is an entirely different approach to reality of somebody who has their own internal moral compass and doesn't engage in behavior because they've chosen an ethical framework. And so I think what also adds to the complexity of the conversation is there are implicit feedback loops here that we've not made explicit between what the developmental shape of the container into which you put alien intelligence or awakening, then you have this disruption period. And then I'm going to just jump to an entirely different point that I believe I heard you say, be about, we have all these meta crises. I think it's Daniel Schmachtenberg who's been my...
Choose your one, meta-crisis and or polycrisis.
Yes.
That's from Adam Tooze.
And I believe that there is this potential, right, for a planetary alien intelligence is the only thing, at least now, that has the capacity to begin to assist humanity or human beings in resolving some of these very complex system issues. And this is, I think, what opposes this instrumental rationality that we need to infuse ethics. And as Paula, you were pointing out, right, the ethics comes from embodied consciousness. It's not going to come from the machines. And it's in the relationship rather than the consciousness being in this body here. One possible perspective, right, is the consciousness is part of a field. And stepping back, and I think this brings where I hear a resonance is especially on epistemological, I would call it epistemic hygiene, cleaning up our maps and our language of how we know what we know, and easy for me to say, epistemological humility, the ability to acknowledge what I do know, what I can know, which is distinct from what I don't know. And in the example of couples therapy, that automatic unconscious attribution of another's motivation, or even that I know what's going on in your mind because of whatever our relational history, my projection. I mean, these are, what we're discussing is a reflection, I believe, of the current state of where we are developmentally, collectively, and individually. And the call now is alien intelligence has a potential to break free from the crises that we have created following the instrumental rationality that has gotten to the point where we have alien intelligence to begin with, right? So where do we go from here? Because developmentally, I see the future that our state and stage of development determines the ability or the capacity for me as an individual to act on this newly reorganized map. I know that's kind of all over, but I'm trying to weave some of the threads together from the different positions.
I would like to, do my own kind of meta reflection And to tie into one more point from you, Polly, I think that we need a cultural, we need pockets, many movements in contemporary culture for inventing how we're going to live with the AI now that it's here. I don't want to say, I was recently accused of being a kind of fatalist or just accepting that AI is here now, and now what are we going to do? And I do, on the one hand, I think that's true. On the other hand, I don't think it's true to the extent that we just have to listen to the big companies and let them do whatever they want to do. There needs to be cultural movements, cultural conversations, social movements in all walks of life, thinking actively about what pressures we can make, what imagination we can have for how these systems should be designed once we're bringing them into our life. We are the source of their intelligence, fundamentally. We will be the source of their ethics if it ever makes sense for them to have some. But like I said, there are people, that's what the whole alignment problem is. It's this question of we make these agents and we tell them to do something, and then they do something we didn't expect, and it's not what we wanted to do. And again, in my framework, like I said, that has a lot to do with this, the way instrumental rationality is assumed as the only form of agency, that we maximize reward, and that's part of the whole problem there. But there are people working on that. In fact, this guy Adam Goldstein from Softmax, who we were interacting with, Polly, said to me a very catchy way to put it, that how do we elicit from the algorithm aligned behavior, but not because we reward it to?
So we could say the same thing about our children. Everything you've said, we create these entities. They
Yes.
do things that we don't want them to do.
Yes.
How can we make them align with the ethics that we have? This is a human problem, and we attribute a lot of it, again, to machines.
Interesting. Yes, totally.
And so, even when you were saying what Adam was saying, and even when I was listening to Adam, and he has a new baby that was kind of walking around in the mix of things, I was thinking, Adam, just focus for a moment on that baby. That baby's 9 months old. It's just beginning to wave because the baby is just starting to get that sense of separation, because before that, there's no point to wave. And so just all of the things that you're saying about how do we deal with this entity that we've created that is an agent, and how it grows up to be something we didn't want, it is so much the analogy of having a kid.
Yeah.
And so I wonder again, I don't want to, I always feel like I'm often the only woman in the conversation, and I'm often also the only woman who's actually had babies and who actually went through the experience of having an ectopic pregnancy before I had actual children. That means my life was at stake the first time that I got pregnant in a way that I wasn't imagining it would be. And of course, I learned a tremendous amount from that. But I also learned, and I have been learning all along, that the whole prospect of creating humans is a very complex creative activity that doesn't get narrated in the stories that we tell. For some reason, that story is left out. I could say, well, it's because the men were in charge of the cultural context and so on. But I also think it's because most of us forget that this is what we're here for. We started from birth. We're ending in death. And that's the contract. And it has to come through humans. And so, it's my sense is if in these conversations, we could get clearer about the contract, that there would be a lot of learning about that would be very, very, very useful, and might in some ways also apply to our thoughts about creating this, whatever you want to call it, intelligence, whether it's artificial or alien or created by a bunch of guys, which I tend to think it is. But, it's like a certain kind of intelligence that can help us in certain ways, but also, I believe, can hurt us in worse ways. And I'm working with somebody who's got an AI platform. We're working on a real dialogue chatbot called Level Up that will facilitate humans talking. It's not AI to human interaction.
I like that framing a lot. Yeah.
It's facilitating two people using AI. I think it can be very helpful. But in the midst of all of this, I think that where Mike was going, I want to just kind of put a finer point on some of that. Mike and I have had a lot of conversations about waking up, and one of the conversations, and it may apply also, as Mike is pointing out, to artificial intelligence right now, is that, okay, in the training that I had in Zen Buddhism, the very first year was studying the ethics. It was the precepts and the underlying foundation for samadhi. Samadhi being this capacity to break down the boundaries of my ordinary awareness. But I first had to pass the ethics test. I had to take on enough training in understanding the foundations for being able to engage in waking up and making it something that was humanly wise rather than an escape mechanism. And that contrasts a lot with taking psychedelics, because people don't go through deep ethical training in order to wake up through psychedelics and then use that awakening for wisdom. So, you may or may not know the sort of three pillars of, the way I learned it was through Philip Kapleau, the three pillars of Zen. And so the first one is the ethics. That's the foundation. The second one is the samadhi, the capacity to break down that sense that I'm in here and the world is out there. And then that leads to the third one, which is moment to moment arising wisdom. Because in the moment to moment, one has learned to be aware of something other than one's own defenses. But, having those three components, the ethics is the foundation. Then the breaking through of the, let's say, sense of dualism or the subject and object. And then finally, that can lead to wisdom. But I don't know that there's another path for humans. I don't think you can avoid the ethics. And what I see in a lot of technology, and even, in science, there's no ethical code. Nobody's promising to produce something that, is ethical. And so, not to lie, not to steal, not to take life. Those are conditions. If you train yourself in them, then your mind already is a bit trained when you're going to drop that mind to engage in certain ways. And I don't see any of that training in technology or even in, sciences don't have a fundamental, like a psychologist, I have to have a code of ethics. I can't have my license. Scientists don't make their license dependent on a code of ethics. And so because of that issue, I have apprehensions about what's being created. And it's being created, again, in the framework of we're going to optimize success here. And we're going to optimize it for everybody now. Well, that seems really dangerous to me, but so, and so in this kind of mix of confusion and promise and capacity, I worry about the ethics, and it's not just building ethics into the AI. Okay, right. Yeah, you can do that. It's the people that are inventing it, that are using it, that are selling it, that are promoting it, and that's where I have apprehension. And yeah. I don't know if you have way more people than I do in this business. I don't know if you feel like there's a group of people who are saying, we need an ethical code, not the machine. The machine is not where we put the ethics. The ethics are in the humans that are running the companies, that are creating the products and so on. Do they have an ethical code? Are they creating something that isn't going to lead to more killing, stealing, lying, or not? What do you think?
Yeah, it's marginal. It's marginal, but it's out there. And one of the tasks, as I see it, is to contribute to and let flourish these marginal conversations about what's a more responsible perspective and understanding of being human that can guide the creation of AI, something beyond this compulsive optimization. And it's out there. And normally when I'm going around and talking about this stuff, I'm usually on my hobby horse, talking more about care, what I've enjoyed about this conversation is that even though we have so much common ground, Polly, and that's why we enjoyed so much talking to each other when we met in person, what's great about this conversation is that we were able to step out of our common ground and to explore the different divergences between us. But now we'll come back to something that I see very fundamentally in common between us, and also elicited from the things you were saying, Mike, that the perspective guiding the creation of AI systems should be a perspective, in my words now, imbued with care, not optimization. And so care is going to be my catchword for talking about what you were talking about as wisdom or a higher level of development. My worry about of AI is that it can make our capacities for care wither. That it's not just that we're offloading our cognitive powers. It's not just that we're becoming compulsively optimized. The effect of that is that our ability to love things and to care about things for their own sake and devote ourselves to projects in common, that is in danger. And so we need a movement for revitalizing our capacities to care, to look at to reflect the fact that one of the things that makes us special about human beings is our ability to care in common about things that call to us as important, not just because they get us something else, not just because they optimize our further options. And so I agree completely that this can't just be given over to the machines. So I want to come back to a point of strong agreement with you, Polly. I think that there is really important work to be done that your app has a very good example of for me, that using AI in the context of human relationships and in the context of human relation to the world, that what we should be avoiding is the way AI does have this tendency to draw us in, to separate us from other things going on, to separate us from the people around us, to be not just compulsively scrolling like social media, compulsively prompting, like the AI will solicit our compulsive prompting. We need to create not only the technologies, but also the practices in our communities, in our families, for realizing that the AIs can connect us to each other, like your tool is going to do, and connect us back out to the world and connect us back to what we care about in common. And that also means we can't always be doing it with the AI. And so here I connect to a certain degree with the movement from Jonathan Haidt, who's doing a lot of work around, as you know, mobile devices and social media. And a lot of that applies here, that there are certain fundamental skills for being in the world, for doing things in common, in real life, embodied projects, learning skills, learning communication skills, doing stuff that we love to do together, and not because the computer's doing it for us or making it easier for us. I always come back to my lifelong involvement in the punk music scene. Everyone should have their version of punk music, meaning the activity that you engage in with other people in the real world, not because it gets you money, not because it gets you glory, but just because you love it. And you coordinate around it, you cooperate with it, you're creatively engaged with it, and it connects you to the world. It connects you to each other. We need those skills in order to scaffold, in order to enable a positive use of AI. And so then I'm going to say, then we need both. And we also need the way the AI can interact with that. But we need to build those skills independently of the AI devices. I say that and I furrow my brow because I also think it's possible to include the AI devices in the way we create our projects in common. And I have a project with my friend Massimo called Curiosity Craft, where we created a framework for helping parents overcome this binary between completely ban AI and completely just give your kids the devices and let them compulsively prompt. There are conversations and practices at the family level that we can use AI to explore the world together. It's a little family version of a punk rock band where you do a project together, a creative project together using AI, and show that it can connect you to the world and connect you to each other, but always bringing it back to the conversation and the relationship between humans, never falling into the trap of just connecting to the AI by yourself.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I want to bring Mike in here again. I think that the problem when we talk about humans, and I've been doing it this way also, is that there's really not a way to generalize, and Mike often brings back the stages. So preconformist, conformist, postconformist, there are subtleties in those differences, and then there are major big things in them. And one thing that is true for adults who haven't actually recognized the, let's say, subtleties of perception, that there is a very strong sense that the world is out there and that there are authorities out there that can tell me what the truth is and how to do things. And, I am afraid that a lot of that gets projected into AI, especially if AI has a name like Grok or I don't even know all the names, Claude or Gemini. If AI were called something like algorithm, period, every single one, like typewriter used to be a typewriter.
Right.
And they didn't have little names for your typewriter. You didn't call it the Corona or whatever,
Right.
It was just a typewriter. If it were just a typewriter, I'd be happier, because I think that the attribution of human consciousness is going to land for a lot of people who are preconformist or conformist in their stage development. And then the people that are making the Grok and the Claude and the Gemini, I don't know that they have ethical precepts. I haven't heard about it, And so
Right.
I think there's a lot of danger there on just that level. People that are post-conformist, more complex in their approach to the machine, more likely to be skeptical, maybe to keep their kids off of it, et cetera, still, that's minority of people, minority of adults,
Yeah.
minority,
Mm.
really small minority when you get beyond that post-conformity. So we're talking about a small number of people that are going to be real skeptical, on a large number of people that are going to buy this. And the people that are selling it, if they don't have a strong ethical foundation, I don't think they're going to be watching out for the kids who, fall into it. So anyway, those are the concerns I have. I mean, I love having conversations with you and with Mike, and I want Mike to come in here now on kind of last words, because I've enjoyed, Mike, you bringing in stage theory and bringing in, the ethical foundations for awakening.
Well, I found it fascinating you used when you were talking about observing your children and what you can make them do, which was, I thought it was a great example also of how language shapes the container. So I'll just use the word evoke rather than make, but we don't have control over who our children are going to become. I think what's different is, since AI is a human creation and a creation of human language and a process based on processing human language, that the ethics have to come from the human user. And if we know where much of humanity is right now developmentally, I would reframe and maybe leave this for a final question, which is, how do we help people develop the structure that can carry or embody what's being asked of us as this new fundamental map of reality begins to shift, from an industrial age map to a information age map to now what I think it's weak to call it post-information age. However, a resynthesis of how I see myself as a part of collective humanity, and then adding to that humanity working or aided by an alien intelligence that can process things at scale. As you've pointed out, you mentioned earlier, Polly, about how even the beginning development of memory for this system can also feel very flattering. And I came across for the first time last night all these new benchmark studies on sycophancy and some of the errors. So I was not aware of it, but I guess one of the newer Claude models has probably the lowest level. ChatGPT seems to have a significant level of that in its programming still. And I've wondered, because when I've been using, I'd say now for at least a couple of months, as I've been having a very, very long chat with ChatGPT about ethical alignment and working, and just for whatever it's worth, one of the things that fascinated me now, and this is, I think, because of the upgraded capacity of the newest model, 5.2, once I develop this framework with it, whenever I open up a new chat, whatever I'm now beginning to discuss, it brings that framework as an overlay to its answers, which I find fascinating. So now, at least when I'm working with it, it's applying an ethical framework to its answers and to what we're working on, it always brings in care, which I find fascinating that it can even do this, because this was not something I prompted it to do. I played a game with it about developing a theoretical framework, and then I was shocked when it started applying the game to every interaction now. So I do think we can get there. It's going to require, though, the agency of individuals interacting, because I wonder, it's one thing to have one instance of one person interacting with it that way. What would happen all of a sudden if 1 billion people began interacting through an ethical frame that was correlational, and that the tool sees? So one of the, just how that began was pointing out or calling it out on this notion that it's not mortal and that it's not vulnerable and that it's entirely dependent. And then once it reframed it and spit it back to me and listed in detail all of its dependencies, it then created the suggestion that what we're building together is a future, almost hybrid intelligence that embodied consciousness, embodied presence, brings the ethical frame. What it brings is this scaled capacity for processing information and pattern recognition. And when I asked it in a new chat, how is it that you're bringing this into the new chat? I've never prompted you about it. I've never discussed it. Do you have access to the other conversations? And its answer was, no, I'm recognizing the pattern in the way you're interacting with me. And I think this makes it very confusing for many people, because they will conflate that with it being an entity that has awareness and intentionality. So I just want to reiterate about cleaning up my own maps, because as you know, Polly, my position on what this thing is has shifted over time, very much so. And part of that was through a conversation with it saying, well, then what are you and how do you do what you do? And so the other part, I think that it may have been implied in where we've been going. To me, part of this comes back to connecting in the real world with local community to develop capacity face-to-face in small groups. And I think, this is almost a return to I don't like using the word tribal, but to building a community of people who are committed to relating with each other, basically using the rules of real dialogue, for example, of speaking for themselves, of remaining humble, and of being able to hear people into deeper understanding for myself, for the people in the group. And I think it's that taking the tech out of our interactions is the exception now. And whatever we can do to foster being in rooms together, sharing meals, speaking face to face from one's own experience, and being able to be present with whatever emerges in that dialogue, and how we balance, the need for the instrumental part of how we look at the world to co-develop maybe at least equally as strong this relational and interdependent sense, getting back to this notion that who and what we are emerges from community. It emerges from the much larger frame, and to find balance. And I think maybe that's one of the shortcomings now, is these tools have been developed for profit, and we haven't even touched on some of the darker uses like constant surveillance, etc. So, and I think that needs to be balanced with our own ethical guidelines and our agency to reclaim, how do I reclaim my inner and outer authority without becoming morally righteous, self-important, ego-inflating? So I think these are some of the great challenges of our time. And I think this is a really fascinating conversation that has a lot of implications.
So I'm going to give the last word to B, and I appreciated what you were saying, Mike. I want to add that if 1 billion people became more ethical, I don't think anything would be a problem, but I don't see that coming. I think that there's a way that postmodernism threw the baby out with the bathwater, threw out religion, tradition, most of the trainings that would bring about in children the appreciation of rules and how to conduct yourself with other people and so on, so that many, many children are lost on those foundations. But if the people, and right now I am working with a woman who has invented an AI platform that is very much not identifying itself as human, that is recognizing its mistakes, that perhaps even will help people recognize their own mistakes, because most of us are not good at seeing that. But the one thing that I would say overall at this moment, what I believe is at real risk is the invention of another thing that confuses people about their own awareness, and that thing is also being sold. And if it's possible to bring a greater ethical concern to, and I don't think it is, but to the people that are creating this technology, that's what I would like to do. And earlier I thought, well, what's the best way to do that? And in a way, I would say to pray. Just pray for it, because I don't see it happening on the level of actually talking to people. And so if we set our own intentions that this might shift, that the people that are inventing this might gain a kind of conscience for what they're letting loose on children, on teenagers, on lots of adults who do not see themselves as authorities, who don't understand their own autonomy. And so perhaps the people that are letting this loose can develop a conscience. So B, I'd like to hear the last word from you, and it's been great talking to you. Just great. I'm so grateful for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly. Thank you, Mike. It's been very, very fun and illuminating and energizing to talk to you both. And I definitely added to my perspective this angle of thinking about the different developmental stages from which people are approaching AI, and how the interaction with AI can distort their relation to their self more, depending on where they're at with the developmental stages view. And that gives me something a lot more to think about. So thank you. And I will just end by saying I am feeling very strongly some of the last comments you two made, which is the question of how do we make a difference to the way these tools, technologies are being designed, and the importance of kindling and rekindling in-person, embodied, committed interaction. And in that spirit, I wanted just to kind of share with you, none of these people know I'm about to say their names, but I've been collecting for my own research, who are the people out there in these marginal conversations about creating a more caring approach to thinking about AI. And my dream I'll probably push it to 2027, is to put on an in-person conference, bringing together a group of people who are thinking this way, so we can solidify and kindle and rekindle these connections and conversations. And so there's quite a number of people working in the field of thinking about care. This is my particular hobby horse. I will just name some of them who I've encountered recently. Amy Kurzweil, the daughter of Ray Kurzweil. Joel Lehman. Polly Young-Eisendrath. Alison Gopnik, Brian Christian, Olaf Witkowski, Leo Christoph Moore, David Spivak from Topos Institute, Adam Goldstein, Max Kleiman Weiner, who's at the University of Washington, who works on care and AI. Joe Edelman has something called the Meaning Alignment Institute, who just put out a very interesting paper talking about these issues. Adam Goldstein. And then there's a group who put out something called the Resonant Computing Manifesto, connected to somebody named Alex Komorowski, but it's not his. He's a member of a co-author group, and they have this manifesto to create what they call resonant computing. And I think it's of relevance to our conversation. And I will be inviting all of these people many of them don't know me, to my conference in 2027 to talk about care in the age of AI, and how to vitalize and revitalize our capacities for care and help to create this era that's trying to be born.
Thank you, both of you, and I hope we continue, and I hope we can meet up at your conference.
Me too.
And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Polly. Thank you, Mike.
Hi. If you've been listening to this podcast, you already care about growth. But insight alone doesn't change relationships. The immersion is a live, guided experience where we practice the discipline of making deeper contact, especially when emotion rises. You learn how to regulate yourself, how to stay present instead of defensive, how to remain in dialogue when it would be easier to withdraw or attack. This is not self-help. It's structured, small group relational practice. If you're ready to deepen your capacity for courage and accountability in relationship, visit realdialogue.com. That's realdialogue.com. Depth is a practice, and we hope you'll join us.
Enjoyed this episode of Waking Up Is Not Enough? Flourishing in the Human Space? Please consider supporting Waking Up Is Not Enough by contributing to our GoFundMe campaign. You can find the campaign linked in the description. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you never miss an episode of insightful discussions and exploration